but we'll revert to an unbalanced panel next week when we're at the Conservative Party conference, I'm sure. Right, let me introduce our panel to you. Barry Gardiner, a good friend of the programme, Labour MP for Brent North and former Shadow International Trade Secretary. Kirsty Buchanan, former Special Advisor to Liz Truss while she was Justice Secretary. James Meadway, economist, who was Special Advisor to John McDonnell when he was Shadow Chancellor. And Ben Habib, a businessman who's the chairman of the First Property Group and a former Brexit Party MEP. 0345 6060 973. That's the number you need to speak to our panel. 84850 on the text. And of course, do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
What you're going to ask. We don't sort of rack up calls that we've lined up. They're all instantaneous calls that you bring in, and I hope it'll always stay that way. So let's go to Dean on the Isle of Wight. Hello, Dean.
Hi, Ian, and hi to the panel. Hope you're all well. It's just a quick question. Been seeing in the last few hours a number of people stating that they're likely to see further cuts to vital services and a return to austerity. I'm physically disabled, and we have faced untold damage to our lives over the last 12 years with cut after cut after cut to our services. And I wonder if the panel would agree with me that that is not fair and that we should not face or pay the price for basically a tax cut for the richest in society. We don't ask to be like this, Ian, and we shouldn't face further and deeper punishment.
Right, Barry Gardiner, let's start with you.
Look, first of all, I sympathise with the pain that you have experienced. The efficiency savings that Liz Truss is supposed to have now requested from her departments clearly are cuts. They're happening not just because of this, the top rate of tax being reduced for the mega wealthy. It's not just that. That's actually a very small part of this. What's happened is that the Bank of England, which has been pushing money into the economy to sort out the pandemic, was on the point of actually taking money out of the economy. And because of the incompetence of the Chancellor last week, has been forced to do a U-turn.
And put another 65 billion in for good measure.
Indeed. And that's why we've seen this chaos in the markets. It's why we've seen pension funds concerned that they aren't able to meet their liabilities to pay people's pensions because they hold gilts. That's basically an IOU from the government. And the price or the value of those gilts has plummeted. So they're worried. And what that's done is it's fed instability in the market. And so the Bank of England is now having to rush in and save the government by putting more quantitative easing, more money into the economy. And that's why the government is now in a terrible situation and is having to think of making even further cuts in the sort of vital services that you've been talking about. It was incompetence by the Chancellor and it was ideology by the government. And I just pray that they will reverse it. I pray that they will come to their senses and realise that it cannot go on like that.
The point about the budget for disabled people is an interesting one, because whenever we talk about this, lots of people who are disabled ring in and say very similar things to what Dean has said. There have been cuts over the last 12 years. Yet, if there was a Conservative representative on this panel, they would no doubt say that actually the budget for disabled people has gone up. And it's got actually above inflation. And I never understand how that, because both of those things both can't be true. or the money's being misspent and people at the sharp end aren't getting the benefit from it.
It can be true in this sense because it depends on the number of people who are now in need, obviously, and it can also depend on the price that you're having to pay for the care that you're trying to deliver. And as that price goes up, so the deliverers of care are demanding greater profits or just their costs have risen, you can be putting more money into the system but actually getting less care out of it.
That's why we have you on the panel, Barry, because you explain it in very simple terms. Kirsty Buchanan. Now, let's concentrate on Dean's question before we come to the wider issue of what's happened over the last few days.
Yeah, I mean, politics isn't global and it's not local, it's people. And I think what we've seen over the last week or so is what happens when political ideology that sort of is created in a petri dish, if you like, or think tank groupthink, hits the realities of people's lives. And your point about, how can money go up and yet still the services are cut? Well, one of the reasons for that is inflation and the inflationary costs. And with inflation at double digits, the idea that you should forge ahead with the sorts of measures that we've seen in the mini-budget without a consequential thought of what that does to people on the front line, people in communities, disabled people, people struggling with mortgages, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, is one of the reasons we're seeing some of the pushback we've had. And the IMF intervention wasn't just about the credibility of the package as a whole. It was about the increase in social inequality. It went out of its way to say, actually, what this does is make equality worse, not better.
Yeah.
And that is a very, when you're getting spanked by the IMF about that, that is a sharp reminder that actually what you should have at front and centre when you make policies is the impact it has on people, real people. And in a cost of living crisis, you want a government that will shore up and have targeted tax cuts, targeted growth and greater protection for the most vulnerable in society. That would seem to be a reasonable and fair way of
so
moving forward.
In your view, you seem to be saying that this is almost ideology gone mad, that the likes of Tim Montgomery from Finding Conservative Home, he tweeted the other day that effectively Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss are the love children of the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Centre for Policy Studies, and they have now got their way.
I'm reminded of a Thatcher quote about inflation.
That's always a good thing.
Always a good. There's a Shakespeare quote for everything and a Thatcher quote for everything. And she said about inflation, when she inherited the same sort of terrible kind of legacy that Liz Truss inherited, of sort of soaring inflation and cost of living crisis, she said, look, you need to tackle this. This is going to be tough medicine, but you need to tackle inflation first and foremost. Inflation, as she said, is the destroyer of all. It's the destroyer of industry, it is the destroyer of jobs, of livelihoods, of society.
And she would bang on about sound money, which seems to be a phrase that the Labour Party have adopted now, rather than the Conservative Party.
Thatcher dealt with inflation first, and then talked about tax cuts. What Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss are doing is they're saying, all we need to do is tax cuts, and then we're going to get growth in the economy.
That's not right, Barry. I don't want to get into a debate about Margaret Thatcher's policies, but when she took office, she cut the higher rate of tax from 80% down to 60% immediately, and she cut the basic rate of tax from 33% to 25% immediately. She did balance it.
No, she didn't.
She did. She balanced it with increasing VAT.
She did not cut it from 33 to 25.
Okay, when did she do it?
Over a period of time.
She cut taxes immediately on taking office. She cut taxes, and I'm absolutely certain I got the 80% down to, and she increased VAT, and I get that. But the problem of the last 12 years, by the way, and we've had inflation, rampant inflation for 12 years. Do not misunderstand that. People look at consumer price index and they think inflation is a new thing. When the Bank of England printed £250 billion in 2010, what we had was massive asset price inflation, which, in my view, broke the way the capitalist system works, because it disenfranchised people who saved their money and earned a living in order to be able to sustain themselves and lived in a cash economy. And it rewarded those who had actually taken massive debts and massive risks during the credit crunch. Asset prices went up and they were bailed out. And nothing was done by George Osborne to help those who had the pound in the back pockets devalued. And that was the breaking of the capitalist system. Austerity is never the way out of a debt problem. And anyone who talks about Liz Truss now having to make funded tax cuts doesn't understand how we get out of this hole. A funded tax cut basically means if you're going to cut taxes, you have to squeeze the economy in some other way. That process will never result in growth. What we have at the moment is a highly regulated economy with taxes at a 70-year high, and now we're experiencing for the first time consumer price inflation, which is more optically present. But we've had massive inflation for 12 years. What we need to do, and this is where Kwasi and Liz are absolutely right, is that we've got to cut taxes and we've got to deregulate. We have to have a vision for growth. Without growth, we cannot get out of the problems which your caller was complaining about.
Well, a bigger economy obviously will benefit everyone because there's a bigger cake to slice up. But when you say, well, we've got to cut taxes, I mean, I instinctively believe in low taxes. But if you want to stimulate the economy, surely you cut taxes for people who are actually going to spend the money in the economy. And if your taxes are cut, if my taxes are cut,
it's rather pointless.
Are we going to spend that money in the economy?
I
suspect we might put it in a savings account.
I absolutely agree. And optically, I wouldn't have cut the 45% down to 40%. But when you look at the reality of what that cut is, and by the way, most of these tax cuts don't come in until April. There's no immediate effect. The reality of that cut is a 2 billion borrowing requirement. 2 billion. And I'm not allowed to hit the table. 2 billion, a 2 billion borrowing requirement. The big spend last week, the massive spend last week, which was for the working and middle classes, was the capping of fuel bills. That's going to cost up to 150 billion. And the markets didn't blink when that happened.
In the wider scheme of things, is still a lot of money. It's money that it could rescue,
but Iain,
it could half rescue social care if it was spent on that.
There is no place for 2 billion expenditure by the government causing the markets to react the way they have. The markets have actually bought in to the political narrative, and the ideology, by the way, is not from Liz and Kwasi. The ideology is this Treasury orthodoxy that we've got to tax our way out of problems. You can't tax your way out of a problem.
Well, that may be so, but what we've got now is a package of measures that came in that spooked the markets, and you can't buck the market, as, again, Margaret Thatcher once said.
Absolutely right. And the Bank of England was absolutely right to bail out the government bond market.
That's the point.
But we mustn't, on this panel, and those that make decisions for governance for this country, mustn't allow policy to be dictated by market movements. That would be a recipe for disaster. You must not. You've got
I
to
thought
see.
you're in favour of free markets.
I am in favour of free markets, but
you're not.
I am absolutely in favour of free markets. But you can't allow a market reaction to pull out the rug from underneath.
Well, it will pull out the rug unless the Prime Minister and or the Chancellor get up in front of a television camera and actually address the problem. And what they do is they send out junior ministers to be interviewed on my programme tonight, which I'm very grateful for, don't get me wrong. But it shouldn't be like that, because it needs one of the top two to reassure the markets, and they haven't done that.
But funnily enough, Liz Truss getting on the telly and talking about reassurance would probably spook the markets even more.
Okay, fine. She's the Prime Minister. That's her job.
Yeah, it's her job to make sure that the markets are functioning. And the Bank of England stepped in today and it made the markets function.
Okay.
And over the medium term, the economic package put in place last week will begin to bear fruit. We will see growth. Absolutely, we will, with the reversal of national insurance, with the
I think it's about time we heard from James.
Sorry,
he's very patient.
Well, that's. I mean, there's some of that I'd agree with in some ways. The Treasury orthodoxy has been a problem. It's been a problem that you have a financial institution in the middle of government that thinks the way it does about where investment should go. That has been a problem. It means you get too much of the investment available publicly going to London, not much in the rest of the country. But that's part of a wider picture. I don't think there's a load of FX traders out there who have now got some ideology in their heads about, oh, well, we're all thinking like the Treasury. I think what you're seeing with the movement in the markets, as soon as he announced, and it was almost exactly as he announced, that 45p rate change, the pound plummeted. And the reason it plummeted is because, all right, all the other stuff, now you're right, £150 billion or thereabouts over 2 years on the energy price cap. By the way, that's a huge liability. We import half of the gas we use in this country. If the pound's falling, that liability gets bigger and bigger. So it's an issue.
And we export half of the other half because we haven't got any storage facilities to store it.
Exactly.
We close them down.
Exactly it. So there's a sort of general problem of short-termism here. And that's kind of what you're seeing with this market movement. They were spooked by the sudden announcement of this 45p. The rest of it was trailed, right? People knew about it. It's priced in by that point. It may be big. It may be a problem down the line.
I mean, it is a fair point to ask. Why would that relatively small reduction in the net receipts for the Treasury, why would that spook the markets unless there were sort of shenanigans going on among people that apparently the Chancellor met 3 days before the budget, who then decide to short the pound on the day of the budget?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of that sort of thing apparently going on.
You can get into all sorts of... I mean, look, if you're a speculator, this is what you do. You speculate, right? And you try and find out what's going to happen. If you can get a whisper or a hint of what's going to be in the budget, then of course you do it.
It's called insider trading, isn't it?
And if
It's
it's
unpatriotic, and these people I regard as traitors to our country.
Absolutely.
And quite likely to, quite potentially illegal in some instances, in some cases. So that's one part of it.
Please.
Yes, and that's one part of it. That's the spook part of what's going on here. But the underlying problem we have, and this is the chickens coming home to roost, really, is that we don't actually have a very particularly productive economy. Yes. We have a weak economy with low growth and low wages. That we have a very large amount of debt, not just government debt in households. I think you're right about this. And then we also have that huge dependency on imports for essentials like gas, like food. Now, put all this together, this is not an economy that's strong, that you can just go, OK, we'll announce whatever we want as the government. This is something very fragile you have to be very careful with. That is not what's happened here. I hate to say it, and I don't like the phrase emerging markets. It's a bit sort of patronising, really. But once you have a government that gets knocked by the financial markets like this is not the behaviour. This is not how a large developed economy normally behaves. This is something that you might see, frankly, in the rest of the world, and that's when the IMF turns up and has a go at you. This is the situation we got ourselves into.
The IMF had absolutely no remit in having a crack at the United Kingdom this morning.
Well, whether they did or they didn't, they did. I mean, they did do it. Just to address something that I said at the beginning of the programme, where Gary has tweeted, Iain Dale just said, we've got a balanced panel for a change on LBC. I didn't quite say that. What I meant was at the Labour Party conference, we had 3 Labour people on the panel, just as next week we'll have 3 Conservatives on the panel. So that's what I meant by we have a balanced panel tonight for a change this week, Gary. Don't misinterpret my words deliberately. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 22 minutes past 8. You're listening to, or hopefully watching, Cross Question on LBC. Barry Gardiner is here, Labour MP for Brent North. Kirsty Buchanan, former Special Advisor to Liz Truss. James Meadway, an economist who was Special Advisor to John McDonnell while he was Shadow Chancellor. Actually, it doesn't say here what both of you are doing right now. What are you doing now, James?
Director of a think tank, the Progressive Economy Forum.
I'll add that to your description. Kirsty?
Media Director at Stonehaven.
What's Stonehaven?
It's a political consultancy.
Right. And we have Ben Habib, who's a businessman who's chairman of First Property Group and a former Brexit Party MEP. A mention was made earlier of insider trading. Anton Sittingbourne has an interesting view on this. He says, how is it insider trading when Rishi Sunak told them what was going to happen in the leadership race, which he did. He did predict there would be a run on the pound in these circumstances. The traders knew what was coming and they've never had it so easy to do their jobs. Well, there you go. Simon's in Dewsbury. Hello, Simon.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
My question to the panel is basically about the media.
Have we lost Simon? Oh, he's dropped off. Right, we'll come back to him. Let's go to Robbie in Chelmsford. Hello, Robbie.
Good evening.
Hello, what would you like to say?
So I'm wondering what the point in tax cuts is when I'm about to remortgage and all of the favourable products are gone and I'm going to be made poorer by the increase in interest rates already.
And have you calculated how much poorer?
Not exactly, but it's fairly significant versus the 1p saving I'm being given for every pound I earn.
Because it'll be hundreds of pounds a month, won't it?
It's definitely going to be hundreds of pounds per month. I hesitate to commit because I haven't finalised the product, but we're talking in the next 3-4 weeks. So this is very real for me, and it could only get potentially worse unless something is actually done to address the problem.
Ben Habib, you support the package, but do you understand where Robbie's coming from, that any little sort of sweeties the Chancellor handed out are going to be more than taken back with the extra mortgage payments?
Well, I mean, I just come back to the fact that the big spend last week was the 150 billion, which didn't spook the market. What did spook the market was the optically difficult higher rate tax cut from 45% to 40%. And traders will trade on the back of whatever they think is going to create a market movement. And what we've got is people effectively getting on that bandwagon and betting against it. And then the markets then begin to have an effect on the economy. They then do have a real effect on the economy. And that's why it's important that the Bank of England did step in today to calm markets down, to hold the cost of government borrowing down. And that's why we have an independent currency and why we have a Bank of England. And what we mustn't do is panic into reversing what are essentially good policy decisions and reverse them because we've had a short-term adverse market movement. The results of what took place, the results of the policies put in place last week won't come to fruition for 6 to 9 months. It'll take time. The cuts don't come in till April. It'll take time for them to feed through into the real economy. And the markets will calm down, of that I assure you, and mortgages will be offered again, of that I assure you. And the bank needs to keep a lid on interest rates.
But the fact remains that if the Chancellor hadn't made that statement on Friday, we wouldn't be having this discussion now. People listening to this programme would not be fearing that their mortgages are going to go up by hundreds of pounds a month.
Well, I mean, I agree. The 45% down to 40% was optically challenging.
But that wasn't the only thing.
It
really isn't. But name me another. Barry, name me one other measure in the budget that favoured the rich over the poor.
It's not about that, Ben. You're totally. Let me explain. Okay, the reason that the markets have done what they've done is because government borrowing is now deemed to be unsustainable, and because there was no OBR forecast that went with the budget, the markets did not have any reassurance from any independent person that actually it was sustainable. And it's the borrowing that is the real problem, because on the back of all the borrowing that had already gone on through quantitative easing in the pandemic, you now have this other borrowing and government spending that is completely unfunded by tax raising.
But do you advocate funded tax cuts? Are you advocating funded tax cuts, Barry? Because you're advocating austerity in that case.
If you would just let me finish rather than shouting over me. Okay? The point is this. The reason the tax cuts that you're talking about and that you're praising will not work is because actually there's a labour shortage in the market. There is a skills shortage in the market. And because British companies do not invest and develop at the rate that they need to in order to become the productive companies that you and I would both wish to see them be. Okay? But because of that skill shortage, because of that lack of innovation, and actually it's partly, I think, also for what you said earlier about give more money to the people who'll actually spend it and make it useful in the economy, because they will spend it. The problem is this. Our companies pay people so little that they have to go on universal credit. That means there is a subsidy from the taxpayer to the shareholder of those companies. That's wrong. That's wrong. So wage levels are a problem here. It's the fact that we pay people so little means that companies get flabby. They think, oh, I can grind down the wages, I can still make the profit, and the government will step in, top up their wages so they won't moan too much. And that means that they get flabby, they don't do the investment, and we now have companies that actually, under a free market that you purport to advocate, would have gone into liquidation years ago.
Right.
And that's what we need. We need to stimulate the economy with the skills, with the innovation, with the labour.
I agree with all of that. I agree with all that. I agree with all of that.
You've had a good crack so far. Let's get James and Kirsty into the conversation, albeit brief if you can, because I need to go to the news in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
James.
I agree with what Barry's laid out just there. The underlying problem is the weakness of the economy. Frankly, something like this was fairly likely to happen. Once we stacked up, and we have been stacking up for at least a decade now, low investment, low wages, low productivity, economy with a big external dependency on all those things we want to import from the rest of the world, something like this was going to happen. If you then throw in the challenges around Brexit, and it is a challenge, if you throw in the issue of the pandemic, the massive rise in the debt that Barry was talking about that the government has, this is an economy that can't really carry all this. It needs to be handled with care, and that isn't what the government did.
Kirsty?
I fundamentally disagree that the reason the markets were spooked as quickly as they were was just because of the 45p measure, although that is unbelievably tone deaf, and I think that Tory MPs will demand that it is reversed by November the 23rd anyway. So I think largely they were spooked by the fact that you have a government that wants to do something incredibly radical without having softened the ground in advance and basically said, we have this huge unfunded tax, universal sort of tax cuts, which are not redistributive, and in essence trust us. We have a credible plan for how this will transform into medium and long-term growth, but we're not going to tell you that for 6 weeks. And I think that sparked it. But the one thing that was predicted was the consequential rise in mortgage rates, and that was predicted by Patrick Minford, who is one of Liz Truss's own economic gurus, and he said, on July the 22nd, I looked at before I came in.
You mean you prepped for the programme?
I prepped. It's a rare thing, but I had some time on my hands, and I prepped for the programme. And on the 22nd of July, Patrick Minford said, "Look, what is likely to happen is that this will lead to the Bank of England having to raise interest rates, and rightly so, because they've been kept low for too long." And it is an important part of course correcting the markets that they rise, and that will probably lead to an increase of £700 a month in people's mortgages. And that is my point about,
And who can afford £700 a month? Unless
not I.
Rich.
No. And I get a very good salary, thank you, Stephen, but I can't afford a £700 increase.
Right. Right. Couple of points of information. Sam Coates, Deputy Political Editor of Sky, has just tweeted this. Number 10 and Treasury ministers reject any notion tonight that there's a crisis. Meetings are continuing on a range of subjects in Number 10, but there's no big focus on the market turmoil. Ministers in Cabinet rubbish the link between Friday's statement and today's turmoil. Number 10 see this this as a communications and stakeholder error, not a policy mess-up. So for them, it's business as usual. I'm as sure as I can be that the Bank of England and much of the City and the IMF do not agree. And I'm as sure as I can be that Conservative MPs do not agree. Here's a WhatsApp message I had from a Conservative MP earlier. I'm going to have to be very careful not to identify them. It says, Iain, I'm embarrassed. This is a complete disaster. The whole thing won't last. The arrogance and incompetence is staggering. Can't believe what colleagues are telling me. I have constituents and friends saying they won't be able to pay their mortgages. This is serious stuff. Now, that's just one MP. Lots of my colleagues are reporting on Twitter sort of similar conversations that they're having with MPs. At some point, they are going to have to put their heads above the parapet, though. That's the only way to change these things. And just to add a note of humour, we have an anonymous text here from someone who says the current market instability is due to the possibility of a Labour government. I'll just leave you with that thought. I have to say, there was nothing I heard at the Labour conference that would have frightened the money markets. There we are. It's 8:33 on LBC. Time for the news headlines with Simon English.
The Bank of England has stepped in to buy as much government debt as needed to calm volatile financial markets. It's had to intervene following the Chancellor's mini-budget, with fears some pension funds would have collapsed otherwise. The US National Hurricane Center has confirmed that Hurricane Ian has made landfall in southwestern Florida. It remains a Category 4 storm, just below the highest category, and has winds of 155 miles an hour. Liz Truss has told the Ukrainian president that the UK will never recognise Russian attempts to annex its territory. The PM's been speaking to Volodymyr Zelensky following so-called sham referendums in Moscow-controlled areas of the country. LBC weather: clear and chilly tonight across southern England, mostly cloudy elsewhere with outbreaks of rain, turning misty across central and eastern England with some low cloud and lows at 9 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:37 on LBC. Barry Gardiner, Kirsty Buchanan, James Meadway and Ben Habib with us answering your calls. Brenton on Twitter says, Iain, so the Tories spent the last 12 years blaming everything on the last Labour government. Now they're going to spend the next 2 years blaming the next Labour government. I'm surprised we haven't had the words winter of discontent uttered at all, but there we go. Right, it is... we can't go back to Simon Indisbury because his line is too unreliable, but I'll ask his question for him anyway. What do you make of Truss and Kwarteng not making themselves available for interviews today? But apparently I can bring you the joyous tidings that our Prime Minister Liz Truss will be giving an interview tomorrow with a local radio station in the North East. That I'm sure will calm the markets. James Meadway, I think back to Black Wednesday in 1992 when, Norman Lamont did emerge at the end of the day, but, when this all happened on Friday and we're now on Wednesday and it hasn't happened, pretty sure Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling in 2008 were front and centre trying to explain what was going on and reassure people. Why do you think that neither the Prime Minister or the Chancellor thinks that they should be doing that?
Well, because you can speculate, but clearly they think they're doing the right thing. That's the line from the Treasury at number 10 at the minute, that this isn't a crisis. This is all, just a jitter on the way to whatever glorious future that they have planned for us. But you're right, it's kind of slightly, it's unusual, it's pathetic, really. Like, you should be out there owning something that you've done on this scale, particularly it's affected so many people. And it doesn't have the impact on what happens to markets and the decisions that people are making over the next few days regarding that. What we do see happening in this country quite often when there's a shock is that it ends up being the Bank of England, which is, by the way, not elected. It's not something that people are supposed to have this kind of democratic say over in quite that way. It's the Bank of England that's now having to get out there and reassure everyone, calm everything down. This huge intervention, earlier say £65 billion, essentially to stop a large number of pension funds becoming insolvent. It's a real sort of financial stability problem they've addressed, with potential consequences, of course, for price stability, because it's just shoving a load more money back into the economy. So there's kind of implications from all of this. If we just have institutions like the Bank of England making those interventions and no sort of political direction from the government that is elected, some time ago, and it's a different Prime Minister, and there's a whole set of questions there, then that's a problem for how the country is governed in general. I think it's something people should take quite seriously.
Kirsty, you've been a senior political journalist, you've worked within government. What would your advice be to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng now in terms of how they communicate not just with the general public but also with the markets?
If nature abhors a vacuum, then politics abhors it even more. And I think the problem with lighting a blue touch paper and retiring, if you like, is that other people move in to fill the space. Yeah. And you're already beginning to see Conservative MPs, and because you have an incredibly unpopular policy for Conservative MPs to rally round, you're already beginning to see Conservative MPs move into that space and say, reverse that 45p decision that is wrong on a policy terms, regardless of how you try to sell it in comms. And I do agree that this was a lot of this was about a failure to soften the ground. If you're going to move an awful lot of political ground very, very quickly, you really need to soften it before you try to do it. So some of it is a comms failure, but that is a clear, straightforward policy failure. That will allow Tory MPs to move into that space and demand that it is removed. Now, clearly, from what they're saying, which is, crisis, what crisis, they're not in a mood for humility right now, which means that actually this will get dragged out before, I suspect, we'll end up in an inevitable position where they will have to reverse that by November, because it just is so spectacularly tone-deaf and indefensible in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So my personal advice would be right now, get out, show some humility and rip this plaster, because eventually you're going to have to ditch this policy.
Because next week there is a Tory party conference, and they won't be able to hide from that unless they cancel it. But I can't really imagine that happening. No,
and and again, in terms of a speech, what I would be advocating right now is you need to accept some humility. You need to give some ground here. You need to understand that you've listened and learned to the concerns of people. You understand how frightened people are, and that you're acting quickly to reverse some of those concerns. That is, what my strong advice would be. I suspect that this is a very bullish government that's determined to ride this out, put its tin hat on and say, this too shall pass and will be proved right in the end. But this is beginning to take on a life of its own, And the government, if it doesn't move into this space soon, is going to lose that thing that governments need in a crisis, which is grip. Where is the grip? Where is the plan? And at the moment, if you create an earthquake and then go into a hiding bunker, then you lose the one thing that you've got as a prime minister, as a leader, which is the ability to go out and grip a situation and say, calm the markets and calm the public by saying, look, this is our plan, this is how it lays out. And actually, that November the 23rd, the next stage of this, where Kwasi Kwarteng, spells out the plan for medium and long-term growth, that needs to be brought forward. We cannot wait weeks and weeks and weeks with a vacuum to find out how we get from where we are now to this vision of growth.
Barry?
The first thing that the government should do is to publish the OBR statement. Because they didn't publish that independent statement, the markets are concerned that the borrowing is unsustainable. If the OBR then actually says, no, this borrowing is not sustainable on the current level, without the sort of swinging cuts in service that, Ben, you were saying earlier, austerity was not the way through here, and I agree, it's not, then they're actually going to have to reverse their position and try and find some income from for the government, and that means taxation.
But the question was about why the Chancellor and the Prime Minister haven't come out and said anything so far.
Yeah, okay. Simon's question was absolutely about that, and they haven't, I think, because one good reason, one bad reason. The good reason that they might have is that it might spook the markets further if the government thought there was an emergency. The bad reason is that actually they don't know. They haven't actually developed a plan. What they should be doing, if the OBR says that this is unsustainable borrowing, is they should then look at putting that 60 billion back into the exchequer, and there's a way of doing it. If they were to put NI onto non-employed income, that would actually raise £30 billion. If they were to put CGT, capital gains tax, at the levels of income tax, that would raise £16 billion. This is a year, every year. And if they were to put the average tax for oil and gas producers up to the level of the global average, it's we were actually the lowest until the windfall tax, but even now we're 6 percentage points below the global average. And if we simply put it up to the global average, that would be £14 billion. That's the 60 billion that they've taken out, put back in, but put back in a way that you've taxed wealth rather than direct income, and you've loaded that onto the people who can most afford to pay. So
they're not going to do any of that, are they?
Well, they may have to, and if they don't do that, Iain, they're going to have to come up with some other ways of getting that money back into the exchequer. Because if this borrowing is unsustainable, what the Bank of England has done is put a patch on it for the moment. But the markets will keep on battering away here, and they'll say, no, you still haven't shown us how this is sustainable into the future.
Ben, briefly, please.
Well, I mean, I think Kirsty's idea was the best, which is they should bring forward the announcement that they intend to make on the 23rd of November and explain exactly what the other steps are that they're taking in government to make sure that we find our way back to growth. I don't agree that everything has to always be in balance. You know, if you're going to go for growth, you do need to cut taxes without funding it either through raising other taxes or austerity. There has to be a vision for growth, and that's why I think they need to come forward with all their other measures. By the way, earlier on in this conversation, someone said that we've got a skills shortage, we've got an employment shortage. There are a record 5.6 billion people claiming some form of universal credit at the moment.
Did you say billion?
Sorry, million.
You meant million.
We're used to talking in billions now. Forgive me. 5.6 million people, claiming a degree of universal credit. And it is virtually possible on universal credit, together with a bit of work, to get very close to the average net wage. And so that gap has to change too. You've got to have the ability to...
Sorry, let me run that by me again. What, you think the if you're on universal credit, you can get close to the average
If you're maximising universal credit and working to the maximum extent you can get quite close, which is not full-time work, you can get quite close to the net after-tax take that you would get on the average wage.
I'm sorry, the Chancellor has just announced, last Friday, that he's going to sanction people who can't work more than 15 hours a week.
I'm not talking about sanctions, Barry, I'm just saying...
But this is exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. And these are people who are looking after elderly parents, because we don't have let me just finish,
well, you interrupted me, Barry, actually.
But, these are the very people who started at the beginning of the show. Dean, who came on, who's disabled, he can't work more than 15 hours a week. The people who are looking after their children, because we don't have universal free childcare in this country. The people who are looking after their elderly parents, having to do that caring because we don't have a decent care system. And you're the one who's now sitting there saying, oh, well, actually, if only these people worked a little bit harder, then everything would be all right. This is ridiculous.
I didn't say that. There were 3 million people on some form of universal credit before lockdowns kicked off. There are now 5.6 million people on some form of People have been taken out of the employment market. They need to get back into the employment market. You talked about an absence of workers. You talked about an absence of skills. You can't fill that gap if you don't get people back into work. I'm not talking about punishing people who clearly are unable to support themselves without government welfare.
That's what the Chancellor has talked about.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the point you made earlier, Barry, that we need more people, more skills, more workforce. And it's not just about raising wages. It's about cutting taxes, cutting regulatory bureaucracy, so that the cost of business reduces, so that all of us can afford more with a pound in our pocket.
We have to go to a break. Thank you very much. We'll come back to your questions in a moment. It's 8:49.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer. Is Labour now the party of nationalisation?
There is the potential for a huge amount of jobs and money coming in through Great British Energy. This will be operated as an independent company, but it will be the rewards of the investments.
No more nationalisation after that.
I'm not ideological. Look at things practically. If it makes sense for Britain, that is something I'll look at.
How much was your parade rained on by the disobliging comments from your former Labour Party colleague Rupert Huck?
What she said was racist, it was wrong, and she's been suspended from the whip in the party.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With Motorway, where dealers compete to give you their best price for your car.
LBC.
With
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:53, if you just joined us, we are with Barry Gardiner, Kirsty Buchanan, James Meadway and Ben Habib. Maria says, if only Keir Starmer was as passionate as your panellist Barry, he would have us all won over. So it's not Maria, it's Marva from Rochester in Kent. I think we were all at the Labour Party conference apart from Ben.
I wasn't there.
No, I'm not surprised. Barry, very quickly before we go to the next question, it was a very different conference from the last time we were in.
Yes, it really was.
When you in those halcyon days when you were in the shadow cabinet. I mean, that conference in 2018 in Liverpool was the worst conference I've ever been to. It was just awful. And what do you put the change down to?
Look, we had some good conferences as well.
Well, wasn't that one?
When I was in the shadow cabinet, but that wasn't one. And it took place in a toxic environment. I think what we saw this week is real confidence coming back into the Labour Party, and not just in the party activists, but actually communicating out to the public that there is hope of making sure that the sort of things that we were just talking about can be resolved. I think I've had people coming up to me now who are Conservatives, and I know they're Conservatives, but saying, well, you've got the next election in the bag. Now, I don't think we have. I think we have to work through our programme. We have to actually prepare for government. But I think people in the country now look at the Labour Party and say, you know what? They are prepared for government. They are talking our language, and I think the conference mood reflected that.
James, do you think that there was a slight danger of overconfidence? I'm not talking about among the politicians, but among a lot of the delegates that I talked to, there was almost a sense that, well, it's all up now after that mini budget, that everyone can see the Conservatives are going to lose and we're just going to walk into power. And I'm thinking, well, one good conference for you does not necessarily an election win.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, look, the election's probably 2 years away. There's a great, just look at the last 2 years. Yeah. There's a great deal of things that can happen between now and then. And going into that conference with that mini budget, with the 17-point lead, I mean, it was the perfect setup for everyone to come out with a spring in their step. Well, yes, and then to come out with a bit of a spring in their step. But also, I think Barry's right. The sort of clarity about what Labour wanted to do. Some big, really big announcements around GB Energy and a few other things that, by the way, they probably won't appreciate putting it this way, but these are very Corbynite things to be doing. This is like a big publicly owned energy company. This is an industrial
national wealth fund.
Exactly. This is all good stuff, and it's all there, and it's presented with confidence, and it looks like it could win. So that's good. The question I think for Labour, and here's me, former advisor to John McDonnell, saying it, is that they're going to have to start talking about how they're going to pay for this. I think there's a question of taxation, and we get a bit clearer with people about what taxes are going to go up to pay for all these.
Isn't it funny? Conservatives spending money like water, and James, former advisor to John McDonnell, talking about, well, how are we going to pay for these? I mean, politics is nothing if not fluid,
they can borrow the magic money tree that the government seems to think is growing in their backyard. But, I mean, look, I worked for Theresa May as well. I was a special advisor at Number 10, and I worked on the delightful 2017 general election. Where
must have been marvellous.
Well, yes, it was so much fun. And we went into that with a 20-point lead. So, I mean, 17-point lead looks good now, but, I mean, these things can be broad and they can be really shallow when you're put to the test.
Wise words. Right, let's go to another call. It's Wesley in Gravesend. Hello, Wesley.
Hello, Iain. Hello, panel. My question is, I hope it's relatively simple. Is it important or essential for Secretary of States to have qualifications in the departments that they run? For example, a doctor to run the health department.
Kirsty.
I'm reminded of someone who asked David Cameron why he wanted to be the Prime Minister, and he said, because I think I would be good at it. No, but what Secretary of State should have around them are good quality, experienced advisors and experts that have real knowledge that is tested in the field. So no, I don't think Secretary of States need to do that, and it doesn't solve the issue of there is no testing ground for being Prime Minister, as whatever it is, 4 Prime Ministers in the last 6 years and an endless Tory psychodrama will stand testimony to. So I don't think you need to be a doctor to run the health service well, but I do think you need to be surrounded by people that know what the health service needs, and it means that you need good quality, trusted advisors in your camp.
James.
Well, of course, let's hear it for good quality, trusted advisors. We're all going to say this is a good thing. But you don't have to be an expert. Kwasi Kwarteng does have a PhD. It's in economic history, isn't it? It's even on a sterling crisis in the 17th century, I think. So you don't have to have that kind of background knowledge to be a good and effective minister. It may or may not help. What does matter is your relationship with your civil servants and with the department you're supposed to be leading. I think part of the story here, by the way, with the panic, was the sacking of Tom Scholar, his removal as head of the Treasury, as Kwasi Kwarteng's sort of opening salvo on this one. Now, I would have my disagreements with Tom Scholar. I think he's one of the architects of austerity. But if you're going to say, OK, well, this is a big radical budget coming up, our preparation for it is to sack the guy who is otherwise running the department preparing it, this isn't a particularly wise course of action to take.
Ben?
Well, I think real-life experience will be welcomed amongst ministers and secretaries of state. They used to have it more when I was, a young boy and a young man. And nowadays, it seems to me many people in Parliament are career politicians. And I think probably the worst qualification you could have in order to be a Secretary of State or a minister is to have gone to Eton and then done PPE at Oxford. I think for me, that is like the kiss of death when it comes to original thinking, practical thinking, understanding what the real issues in the real world are. And Kwasi Kwarteng actually, I think he was at Trinity Cambridge, which is, again, a very rarefied atmosphere in which to be educated. But without wishing to sound flippant, and I'm not being flippant, I think it's a hell of a lot better than doing PPE at Oxford.
Kirsty?
I've already said my piece and hand it over to Barry.
Sorry. Barry.
I don't think the important thing is a degree. I don't think it's expertise in the field that you're in the department of. I think it's an ear. You need to listen. You need to listen to your advisors, you need to listen to the public, and you need an ability to judge and then make a decisive move. Take a real decision. I absolutely agree with Ben when he talks about real life experience. But I also I used to run the shipping circle for the then Shadow shipping minister before 1997. When I came in as a new MP, I went into the whip's office and I said to the whips, do you want me to create that shipping circle again, the experts from the city, for the new shipping minister, who was Glenda Jackson? They said, you stay away from Glenda Jackson, you leave her alone. They didn't want anybody who had any experience or knowledge who could undermine the minister who didn't, or to undermine the civil servants who would tell the minister what to do.
Doesn't work, isn't it?
So you do need somebody who cares about the issue. There's no point in putting somebody in education who couldn't give a fig about education. They need to care about the issue. They need to be listening to everything that's going on in the field, but they don't need to be a teacher.
Right, final text question from Julie in Nottingham. We need 2-word answers here. Sir Kenneth Branagh's performance as Boris Johnson in the new Sky drama series has, shall we say, divided opinion. Who would your panel like to play them in a drama about their life?
God.
Anybody want to kick off?
Well, it would be a very dull drama if it was my life. Who would I have play me? I honestly can't think of anyone.
That's not a good start to the answers here. Barry?
I always used to be told that I looked like the guy in The Office.
David Brent.
That's it.
Ricky Gervais.
So David Brent. So obviously I would have to have David Brent play me, because I've been so many times mistaken for him.
It's better than being mistaken for Mick Lynch constantly at the Conservative Party, the Labour Party conference, which I was. Kirsty?
I have a work colleague that was at conference who was twice mistaken for Keir Starmer from behind.
Well,
and there's a budding career of...
There's a joke there somewhere.
Rear of the year.
Back of the head Keir Starmer lookalike. Look, my ego wants to say Julia Roberts, but my reality probably says Joe Brand.
Joe Brand. No, you do. No, I'm not. I can't say anything.
Don't go there.
No, I won't. James?
God, I have the same thing. Who's the guy from The Thick of It? with the glasses who reportedly I look like. I mean, I mostly grew the beard to stop
Peter
the comparison.
Capaldi.
No, that'd be quite good. Right? He's not the cool guy, the complete
Chris
nerd.
Anderson.
Yes, there you go. That's the one.
You see, I think you look a bit like Matthew Doyle.
Okay.
Keir Starmer's sort of director of comms. Have you thought of anyone yet?
Oh, I would love to be Tom Cruise. Why not?
Never going to happen. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us this evening. In a moment, we're going to turn our attention to the protests in Iran. Particularly want to hear from you if you live in the United Kingdom and originally from Iran. What do you make of these protests? Could they eventually bring down the Iranian regime? We've been here before, haven't we? And part of the reason it's never happened is because they've had promises from the West to support them, and those promises have evaporated. Should we be doing more, or do you think we should just stay well out and let the Iranian people decide their own futures for themselves? 0345 6060 973. It's 3 minutes past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Bank of England is taking emergency action to prevent what it calls material risk to UK financial